So Miombo has adapted to fire. Miombo Woodlands has adapted to fire in that there is an element that fire is beneficial to this kind of habitat in terms of clearing a lot of the undergrowth, allowing new tree seedlings or other seeds to germinate and get established without much competition. But that kind of cycle is going to be every few years. The problem that we are having a lot in Zambia at the moment is that fires are being lit every year. If we have fires coming through every year, what we find is that your larger trees, which if you had a fire every 4 or 5 years, would have no problem dealing with that fire and continue to grow after the fire has passed. If a fire is happening every year, you have a change of the woodland that eventually starts to happen, where certain trees that are much more susceptible to fire are killed off. And those trees that are very resistant to fire start to be the ones that spread, and they become a lot more dominant in a woodland effectively. But the minute you start removing the upper canopy trees, and all of a sudden more sunlight comes and reaches the ground flora, you have a change in that ground flora where taller, more perennial grasses, which favor high light situations, start to invade the woodlands. They get established, and a fire, as those are spreading out, ends up becoming a lot hotter. Because you can see right now, it's very sparse in terms of the grass cover on the woodland floor at the moment that we have here. So if a fire comes through, that fire is going to burn most of this stuff off, but it's not going to be an exceptionally hot fire. And I don't mean that to say that it's a cold fire or anything like that, but the heat of the fire is not going to be such that it's actually going to kill off the older trees. If we had the tall grasses, and when I say tall grasses, these grasses are 2 meters, sometimes even 3 meters tall, and very dense, really dense clumps. In those situations, when you have a fire that comes through with those grasses, because of the amount of biomass that's produced by those grasses, that fire burns hotter. It is usually a much more damaging fire when it sweeps through, and will generally start to kill off larger trees, just because this bark is not really set for a hot fire. It can deal with a cooler fire, a low growing fire, but if you have a fire that will have flames reaching 2, 3, 4 meters up, that will start to climb up into the upper canopy and start to kill off the upper canopy as well. So, you know, the use of fire in these kinds of woodlands is an important feature in the rejuvenation of these woodlands, but not every year. And if we do set fires every year, then we're changing the nature of what the original woodland was into something that would be completely different. It ends up kind of transitioning to a new type of woodland, not the existing Miombo that that I am in love with as I walk through these kinds of woodlands effectively. We have a little bit of a rocky outcrop here, and these habitats also tend to be quite interesting in that they are slightly more protected from fire. If a fire travels through most of the rest of the woodland, here where you have a rock, sometimes you have a disjunct between the ability for that fire to move through the undergrowth. And so these areas sometimes tend to be a little bit more protected. And because of that, you'll find slightly different woody species growing in here. You'll tend to find more specialist herbaceous plants, including ferns, even some orchids that will be more inclined to grow in here. And you tend to get things that will grow a little bit taller, various different shrubby kind of plants and things. It's really dry. There's not really too much to see at this time of year. It's, you know, there's nothing really happening. So unfortunately, we're not getting kind of the best to see in this rocky habitat right now. But give it 1 or 2 good rains and this place will come alive, and I'm sure there'll be a lot more to see at that point in time. But they do make a lovely kind of feature, breaking up some of that kind of flat or gently rolling hills with all of a sudden these jutting rocky outcrops that come up and are just kind of a lovely piece to be able to visit, see, and explore. So here is a kind of case in point about the ground flora of the Miombo. Here we have an evergreen shrub. This is actually in the coffee family. This is a species called Leptactina benguelensis. You can actually see the buds for flowers are starting to already appear. And this is growing on kind of a rocky escarpment hillside. This is a specialist of those kinds of well-drained rocky escarpment hillside habitats and remains evergreen throughout the year. This is actually what is called a suffratax. So that's, for lack of a better term, an underground tree. It is woody, but most of its underground tissues, or most of its tissues, woody tissue, sorry, will be underground. So if a fire comes through and burns the leaves and scorches everything off, it can regrow and continue life as usual. But it also then takes advantage of the fact of the early rains, or even just before the early rains, to flower, to attract pollinators to come and pollinate its flowers during that period when the tree canopy is less dense. Hence it can actually do a little bit more photosynthesis at this time of year, but also then be visible for those pollinators. It does also produce a little green fruit that will turn bright orange when it is ripe. It is edible, but you rarely find them because at this level, almost anything will basically come to eat it. Insects, small mammals like the different types of rodents that will be in this kind of woodland, rabbits, duiker, all sorts of things will eat those fruits. So you rarely find them in fruit, unfortunately. But it has a beautiful little white flower, quite highly scented. And immediately, almost after that first rain, you will see these kinds of little shrubs just completely covered in white flowers, taking advantage of that initial first rains to get their flowers open, to get that activity from those pollinators that are going to be up and active after that rain, to come and get them to be moving pollen between plants and essentially getting the woodland to come alive again. So, you know, I would just like people to be a little bit more mindful if they're walking through natural areas, just to be more cautious. And if you're camping in them, if you're having a cigarette, just be really, really cautious with what you're doing with your light sources, your ignition sources, so that you don't inadvertently cause fires. We have enough of them in Zambia as is. We could do with fewer fires across the country, and hopefully people will eventually adapt to reducing fire within the woodlands.